9,000 years ago, somebody picked up a sharpened stone and cut a hole through another person's skull. And that person walked away. We know this because the bone around the opening grew back, smooth, rounded, sealed. The unmistakable signature of a body that kept on living for months, maybe years, after somebody opened its head. No anesthetic, no antibiotics, no idea that infection was even a thing. Just a hole in a head and a patient who went home. Hold that image, because almost everything you assume about the ancient world is about to fall apart. The story we tell ourselves goes something like this. Before modern medicine, people simply suffered and died, helpless, ignorant, waiting for a cure that would not arrive for another 10,000 years. It is a comfortable story. It flatters us. It is also mostly wrong. Here is the mistake buried inside it. We picture our ancestors as ourselves with the equipment stripped away. A hunter with a broken leg, lying there wishing for an X-ray machine he could only vaguely imagine. But they were not us minus technology. They were something else entirely. They knew the natural world with an intimacy we simply cannot reconstruct. They knew the plants around them the way you know the faces of your own family. They had to. The penalty for not paying attention was death, and death was not an abstraction that visited nursing homes. It sat in the corner of every camp, every season, every winter. When your survival depends on noticing things, you become extraordinary at noticing things. Somebody chews a bitter strip of bark, and the throbbing in their jaw finally stops. Somebody packs a wound with a sticky golden substance, and the wound does not turn green. Somebody drinks from the wrong bend in the river and is dead in 3 days, and every single person who saw it remembers. None of it required a theory. It only required attention, time, and some way to hold on to whatever worked. There were no journals, no libraries, no peer review. But there was memory, and memory in an oral culture is a far sturdier machine than we give it credit for. Knowledge moved through songs, through stories, through the long apprenticeship of a girl walking behind an older woman across a hillside while she names every plant and exactly when to pick it. Multiply that across 10,000 generations, and you get something that deserves a much better name than folklore. You get a pharmacology built by patient observation instead of laboratories, with the database stored inside human beings. And it produced results that are genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. Start with wounds, because wounds were the everyday emergency. A gash from a flint blade. A gore from a boar. A foot opened up on a rock in a riverbed. In a world without stitches or disinfectant, an ordinary cut could turn into a death sentence inside a week. So consider what they reached for. First, honey. Egyptians packed it into open wounds as a matter of routine, and it was one of the smartest choices available to them. Honey pulls moisture straight out of bacterial cells, sits at a pH most microbes cannot tolerate, and slowly releases a trickle of hydrogen peroxide. It is, in effect, a naturally occurring antiseptic dressing. Hospitals today stock a sterilized medical-grade honey and pack it into wounds that will not close any other way. We circled all the way back around. They reached for clay. Not any old mud, but specific mineral-rich clays, and cultures separated by entire oceans landed on the same trick independently. Some of those clays kill bacteria on contact, including strains that shrug off modern drugs. Nobody in the Neolithic could have told you why. They could only tell you that this particular pale earth, from this particular bank, did something the ordinary dirt did not. They reached for spider silk, pressing webs straight into bleeding cuts. It sounds like pure superstition until you learn the silk carries vitamin K, which plays a real role in clotting. Modern materials, scientists have spent serious money investigating spider silk for wound closure. Once again, ancient people had stumbled onto something completely real. And then there is the one that makes audiences physically recoil. They used maggots, deliberately, on purpose, placed into infected flesh and left there. Now the part that reframes it. Blowfly larvae are astonishingly disciplined eaters. They consume dead and rotting tissue only, and they will not touch living tissue, which means they perform a version of surgical debridement more precisely than a human hand with a blade. Aboriginal Australians used them. Maya healers used them. Army surgeons noticed something strange on the battlefield. The wounded men whose injuries had been colonized by flies were, against every expectation, doing better than the men whose wounds had stayed clean of them. Today, sterile larvae are grown in laboratories and applied to wounds that antibiotics cannot rescue. The treatment has a billing code. Ancient people were not being disgusting. They were being empirical, with far less squeamishness standing between them and a solution that actually worked. But the surgery is where it stops being clever and starts being genuinely hard to believe. Return to that hole in the skull. The technical name is trepanation, and it is not some rare curiosity. Perforated skulls have surfaced across Europe, across the Andes, across North Africa and Asia. Thousands of them, spanning thousands of years. In some collections, the survival rate implied by the healed bone is startlingly high. Better, in fact, than certain European hospital procedures of the 1800s. Some skulls carry 2 openings. A few carry more, which means the person went through it, recovered, and at some later point agreed to do it again. We can guess at the reasons. Relieving pressure from blood pooling under a cracked skull would genuinely save a life, and a head injury from a fall or a fight was common enough. Others may have been attempts to treat seizures or crushing headaches, or something the community understood as a spirit that needed a way out. Ancient healing did not separate the physical from the sacred. But the archaeology is not remotely ambiguous about the outcome. Somebody opened a living skull with stone, and the patient's body had time to heal the edges. There is a skeleton in France, around 7,000 years old, missing part of an arm. The cut is clean. The bone end is rounded and remodeled, which only happens if the person survives, and survives for a long time. Think about the infrastructure hiding behind that one fact. Someone had to make the decision. Someone had to perform the amputation. Someone had to stop the bleeding, dress the stump, and keep it from festering. Then somebody had to feed, carry, and clean a person who could not work for weeks. That is not a lucky accident, and it is not one heroic individual. That is a group running a functioning system of care. Here is a comparison that should genuinely unsettle you. Hand washing did not become standard practice in Western hospitals until the 1860s. For a stretch in the 1840s, walking into a hospital carried a worse chance of dying than being cut open on a battlefield. A surgeon working outdoors with a freshly napped stone edge may, by pure accident, have had cleaner conditions than a respected European doctor 8,000 years later. Progress has never been a straight line. But instruments and remedies are only half the answer to how anyone survived. The other half was internal. An immune system is not a static piece of equipment. It is a learning system, and it learns hard. Every infection a person survives leaves an imprint, and every generation that survives leaves a broader one. Ancient humans met an incredible variety of microbes from the moment they were born, constantly drilling their defenses. The ones who lived to adulthood were often formidably robust. But the cost of that training was appalling and should not be softened. In many ancient populations, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 of children did not reach adulthood. The immunity of the survivors was bought with the lives of the ones who did not make it. That same mechanism, running quietly across centuries, explains one of the worst catastrophes in human history. When Europeans crossed the Atlantic, they carried smallpox, measles, and influenza inside bodies whose ancestors had been paying that terrible tuition for generations. The peoples of the Americas had never met these organisms and carried no inherited defense at all. In some regions, the population collapsed by around 90%. There was nothing superior about the newcomers. They simply arrived holding a receipt for suffering their own ancestors had already endured, and it worked like a weapon nobody consciously aimed. Your immune system is, above everything else, a ledger of what the people before you managed to live through. There is a second internal advantage, and it lives in your gut. The trillions of bacteria in your intestines are now understood to be tangled up with immunity, inflammation, digestion, and even mood. By that measure, ancient humans were almost certainly in better shape than we are. Their food was wildly varied. Dozens of plant species across a year, rather than the narrow rotation most of us eat. They handled soil constantly and swallowed some of it. Nothing they touched was sterile. And nearly every culture on Earth independently invented fermentation. It began as a way to stop food from rotting, but it had a side effect nobody planned. Fermented food is absolutely saturated with living bacteria. Cabbage buried until it soured. Milk left to thicken. Grain and roots turned tangy in a pot. Every region built its own version, and every version was a probiotic delivered without a marketing department. Studies comparing the gut bacteria of modern foraging peoples with city dwellers keep finding the same gap, and it is not small. The foragers carry a far richer ecosystem. Richer ecosystems track with lower rates of the autoimmune and inflammatory conditions that have climbed steadily in industrialized countries, and a growing line of research suspects a link to how thoroughly we have scrubbed the microbial world out of our lives. Please do not take that as an argument against hygiene. Sanitation has saved more lives than almost any medicine ever invented, and you should absolutely wash your hands. But the tidy equation of clean equals good and dirty equals bad turns out to be a much messier relationship than we assumed. Then there is the part that sounds least scientific and is, awkwardly, extremely well documented. Belief changes outcomes. The placebo response is not a loophole or a flaw in study design. It produces measurable changes in pain, in stress hormones, in immune markers, and in how fast people recover. It even shows effects when patients are told outright that the treatment is inert. Which brings us to the healer, the figure every culture on Earth produced under some name. Treatment was rarely a quiet transaction. There was preparation, and repetition, and smoke, and sound, and specific objects handled in a specific order. The whole group gathered and stayed. Modern eyes see theater, but strip away the metaphysics and look at the signal the patient's nervous system was receiving, hour after hour after hour. I am being attended to. My people are here. Something is being done. I have not been abandoned. That message measurably lowers stress hormones, and the downstream effects of that are real. This is not an argument that ritual cures infection. It does not. Someone with a ruptured appendix in the Bronze Age was going to die, and no amount of chanting changed that. But it is an argument that those healers were pulling a lever that genuinely exists in human biology, without any language to describe what they were pulling. Modern medicine has spent decades rediscovering the same lever under new names, documenting that a doctor's manner changes patient outcomes and that social support improves survival in serious illness. We arrived at the destination with better instruments. They got there first, in the dark. Honesty demands the other column of the ledger, and it is heavy. An appendix that burst was fatal. An infection past a certain point was fatal. A tooth abscess reaching the jaw could kill an otherwise healthy adult. Childbirth was dangerous for both mother and child to a degree that is difficult to absorb. Bones that knitted crooked meant a lifetime of pain. The famous claim that ancient people only lived to 30 is real, but badly misunderstood. It is an average, and averages get dragged down brutally by deaths in infancy. Clear the first dangerous years, avoid violence and childbirth, and living into your 60s or 70s was entirely possible. We find skeletons of people who lived for decades with worn arthritic joints, with old healed fractures, with injuries that should have finished them. Old age existed. It was simply never promised. And here is perhaps the most sobering thought of all. Many of the diseases that emptied ancient villages have not been defeated. They still kill enormous numbers of people right now, in places where the pharmacy you can reach in 10 minutes does not exist. Modern medicine is not a background condition of reality. It is a recent, fragile, unevenly distributed achievement. Ancient medical knowledge was also not a scattering of lucky guesses. It was organized, deliberate, and, in places, written down. Egyptian medical texts catalog hundreds of preparations alongside descriptions of the body and its vessels, mixing observations that hold up today with incantations that absolutely do not, because to the people writing them, there was no boundary between the two. Physicians in ancient India described surgical procedures in such detail, including techniques for rebuilding a nose, that British surgeons in the 1700s traveled there specifically to learn from practitioners still using them. Greek thinkers advanced a genuinely radical idea that illness came from natural causes rather than divine anger, and quietly founded everything medicine would later become. And the oldest medical writing we possess, pressed into clay in Mesopotamia over 4,000 years ago, is not a prayer at all. It is a set of instructions. This symptom, this plant, prepared this way, given at this time. Change the alphabet and it is a prescription pad. So the answer is not that they were tougher or luckier, or that the world was somehow gentler back then. They survived because they were never truly without medicine. They had compounds that genuinely worked, drawn from plants cataloged through relentless observation. They had wound treatments that suppressed infection without anyone knowing infection existed. They had immune systems tempered by exposure and paid for in loss. They had a microbial world living inside them that we have since partly dismantled. They had healers who could summon the body's own repair through ceremony and presence. And underneath all of it, they had the one resource we still cannot synthesize. They had each other. We are not solitary animals and never have been. Isolation is now recognized as a risk factor for early death on a scale that rivals smoking, while strong connection sits firmly on the protective side of the ledger. Ancient communities kept their injured alive by carrying them. They fed people who could not hunt. They treated the old as a repository worth protecting, because everything the group knew was stored inside their heads. The community was not a backdrop to their medicine. The community was the medicine, which leaves us somewhere strange. We have machines that photograph the inside of a living brain, drugs that dissolve tumors, surgeons who operate through incisions the width of a pen. All of it would look like unambiguous sorcery to anyone alive before 1850. And yet, the fundamentals have not shifted at all. Eat real food, and a wide variety of it. Move. Sleep. Do not carry your stress alone. Stay close to your people. The tools became unrecognizable. The creature using them did not. So the next time you tip a couple of pills out of a bottle and get on with your afternoon, take 1 second to consider what it took to get you here. Somewhere far behind you is a line of people who faced a world stocked with 1,000 ways to die, armed with nothing but their eyes, their memories, their stubbornness, and each other. They tested plants at real risk. They opened skulls with stone and got it right often enough to keep trying. They put larvae into wounds on purpose, because it worked. And they cared more about the outcome than the horror of it. Enough of them figured it out, often enough, for long enough, to eventually produce you. And you, sitting here right now, are the living proof that it worked.